and I just remembered I need to start recording this. Um, so this is the edition that we're going to use from Penguin Random House. The translation is by Mark Musa. The edition that I like the best is called The Portable Dante, and that's the entire Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And at the end, it also includes a separate work that's called The New Life, which was it, the work of Dante's youth that set him on the stage as, one of the greatest poets in. The New Life is the story of his young love with Beatrice, and Beatrice is the figure that sets everything in motion for Dante to see the afterlife. So understanding the story of Dante and Beatrice is necessary to get the most out of how the character Beatrice is used the in Purgatorio and Paradiso. So having the translation of the New Life at the end, and it's a very short work. I mean, you can read it in a couple of hours. Having that in this edition is what I really. Beyond that, I think Musa does a very good job of limiting himself in his footnotes. At the bottom of the page, he will give you what you need to understand to make it through these lines. And he doesn't go over. This is, in my mind, this is the best edition for a first reading of Dante. But of course, we can't just leave it at that. A lot of people own editions already, and I'm not going to discourage them from using it.
But that one would be the one that, as you're going through the class, would be very
Yes.
easy to read side by side and make notes in and do.
Exactly.
Okay.
The way that I present the text in class is the same way that I presented it in Augustine's Confessions.
Okay.
Except here, well, no, in Confessions, I think I presented everything and I just blurred through the slides really, really fast, which probably didn't make it the easiest to follow for students. But here, the text that I present is Mark Moose's translation.
Perfect. Okay, that will be very helpful. Yeah, because I'm like I say, if it's line for line how you're reading it and versus what I'm seeing, that's very, very helpful. So thank you.
Of the other editions, because I'll always have people who ask about other things. The only other translation that I'll recommend is Anthony Esselin's. It's a good translation. Esselin himself is a poet. His translation tries to get some of the poetry and does a good job, but Esselin himself certainly wouldn't put himself anywhere close to the same level as Dante as far as poetry goes. But the real benefit to Esselin's edition is the commentary it has is written from a explicitly Catholic perspective. Most of the people that write about Dante are at least practical atheists, if not open atheists. And they're writing about him from an academic perspective, which can include a lot of good information, but it misses the entire point. One of the books that I'll recommend, I could go on all day with extra readings that would be good. Actually, no, I couldn't go on all day. There's a very limited number of extra readings that are actually helpful for Dante. This is the one that I would really recommend. Spiritual Direction from Dante and Voiding the Inferno. This is by Father Paul Pearson of the Oratory up in Canada. I think it's in Toronto. Father Pearson had the task of teaching seminarians the basics on giving homilies. And what he recognized is the biggest obstacle that seminarians were facing was that they don't know how to read literary texts. And it's not of seminarians, it's of pretty much everybody in the Western Hemisphere right now. The way that education's gone in the last 70 years, in school, we don't actually learn how to read literary texts for literary appreciation. We can figure out how to answer questions for like an AP exam, but the idea of reading, especially the way that Dante read and the way that Dante then wrote, his expectations for readers, we've just kind of lost that ability. So what Father Pearson did as a way of sort of helping these seminarians appreciate literature, because scripture, of course, is inspired and it's sacred and it's in a completely different category than literature, but it's amazing literature as well. And if you don't have the sensibilities to literature, you can end up saying a lot of, I want to say dumb things, but since I'm talking about seminarians, I kind of want to avoid that, but it's already out. If you don't know how to read literature from as a literary work, um, something that is literature, and the the Gospels were clearly written that way. Anyway, Father Pearson, in order to solve this shortcoming that he discovered, ended up writing a commentary on Dante because he found it as an easier way of approaching, since it's not sacred scripture, you can discuss it much more freely without being concerned that you're taking a horribly wrong approach that might go down the road of heresy, which of course is something that is worth taking seriously and therefore being cautious about. All of that is to say, he has his commentaries. This does not include the text of Inferno itself. You can actually read it independently of Dante, and it's just good spiritual. But it's a very good commentary that has a more of an ongoing spiritual meditation. This would be the way of saying it. So this is something else that I'll recommend for the students who would just like even more to read than one of the most complicated poets that we have. All of that to say, this is the edition we'll be using, the translation of Mark Musa. Now, Musa's translation also appears in a different set of texts. And I'm seeing if any of them are showing up here. Because, of course, if you are a publisher and you have translations to the entire Divine Comedy, why not divide that up into 3 parts, and then you can sell the individual sections one by one. So Penguin Classics also has Musa's translation in 3 separate editions, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. These editions have the really wonderful feature of facing page translations. If you have any familiarity with any Romance language, if you can read even partially Spanish or French, or you have a smattering of Latin, I would encourage you to get the facing page translation, because it'll allow you to get a sense of what the poetry sounds like, even if you can't really make sense of the words. Because Dante's poetry, in the lyrical sense, the music of Dante's language it's just unsurpassed. And even if you can get a smattering of it from stumbling through, half remembering your college Spanish or French or Latin or whatever, That's better than nothing. And in class, I will very often read the original lines in the original Italian so that we can all get a sense of what the sound is like, because the sound is something that's really central, and of course it gets lost in translation. Dante's worth doing in translation, but you do lose quite a bit. So I like to bring in the original language from time to time. Uh, Part of me wants to read all of the passages in the original Italian and just have the translations up on the screen, but I think that would be a bit excessive and frustrating for many, if not most. And Bonnie, as I see that you're in the room, since there's only just a couple of us here, I thought it would make more sense to have more of a free-flowing conversation than a set lecture. Um, Usually with these things, people kind of trickle in and out. And if enough people are here, I mean, I'm certainly happy to give a sample lecture at any point in time. But if you're coming to this with specific questions or specific requests, I'd like to go ahead and try to deal with those immediately.
Hi, I don't have any specific questions. Just interested, taking some of your other courses, and I did buy Anthony Esselin's Inferno just because I've read some of his. I'm reading his book on the prologue of John, and I
Oh, I
just
haven't seen that one.
I just love the way he does things. So I'm gonna try that one, and
I
then
am so insanely jealous of the time that he has to write. Yeah, of course, being at a different stage in life, I have a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, uh, and a job that does not give me any research time. But just the amount of time that he has to write, the amount that he's able to produce, of very high quality writing. There's a lot of people who can write a book a year, and they're all very mediocre books. He's able to write about a book a year without repeating himself for 80% of it, and without being dull or mediocre. And that's really hard to do. So if you've read anything else of his and you appreciate him, by all means, read his edition. He, the way that he translates, which is very helpful here. Um, if you open up the edition, you can see, I can, delightfully enough, Zoom does not want to show any of my books. It wants to read the books as, oh, there we go. It decides the books are background and kind of just cuts them out in green screen. But if you can see here, he not only does the facing page, but his translation is more or less line by line. So when you're reading Esselin, the line numbers will match up with the line numbers that we have here in class. Both Musa and Esselin translated this way. Um, so as long as you don't get lost, because you're able to be cognizant of the fact that what I'm saying is going to be very slightly different from what's on the page in front of you, um, you can stay on top of things just because those numbers will remain the same all the way throughout. And then Esselin, along with, um, he keeps his footnotes very limited, even more so than Musa, but he also includes with each one in the back, he's got a very good set of appendices. Um, and he also has longer notes for each canto. So in a sense, Esselin kind of combines what we get out of Musa's translation and out of Pearson's commentary. So for the notes for Canto 1 in Esselin's edition, um, He gives the page number, but he also gives a line number, which is incredibly helpful. He had very good editors with this press. And his notes for Canto 1 go on for, 4.5 pages, which is good. It's enough to really get into something, but it's not so much that you get lost in all of that. And he also gives good paragraph or 2-paragraph introductions to each canto with sort of major issues to be looked at. So that's the reason why his is the only other translation that I can really recommend.
Great, thanks.
And there's something, when you're dealing with a very difficult poet, there's something very comfortable in having a guide that you already trust. So if you've taken my classes before, hopefully, I've established that trust. If you've read anything that Esselin's written, he's established that with you. And we'll notice that Dante himself does that. In Inferno 1, he has his favorite poet of the classical world, Virgil, show up, and Virgil is his guide through all of Inferno and almost all of Purgatory. And then Beatrice takes over, and Beatrice will be his guide through the end of Purgatory and then all of Paradise. And if we have the sense of the medieval church being one of women that were silent, that's definitely not the case. In a lot of ways, women had a larger voice in the medieval church than they do in the modern church. And Dante, in particular, with what he does with his character of Beatrice, she has by far the most lines in Paradiso. Beatrix Loquax is one of the terms that's used in Dante studies to describe her. Loquacious Beatrice, who goes through and describes to him literally the secrets of all of the universe in line after line after line. Nevertheless, the whole point here being that when you're going into difficult things, you absolutely need that trusted word of guide. Christina, I see that you are in the room now. Since it's just a few of us right now, rather than doing a traditional lecture, I'm just having a back and forth with any questions, any concerns, anything that you're bringing that I can take care of, basically right now.
Thank you. I just wanted to see about this enrichment course and which one to take. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so since we have 4 of us now, and we're 25 minutes, and we'll go ahead and begin at prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this Psalm 19. If you love the Psalms, this is a psalm worth really meditating on. I use it as an introductory prayer throughout almost all of Paradiso and many other content and many other parts of Inferno and Purgatorio as well. Just because Dante so clearly loved this psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the work of his hands. Day unto day conveys the message, and night unto night imparts the knowledge. No speech, no word whose voice goes unheeded. Their sound goes forth through all the earth, their message to the utmost bounds of the world. There he has placed a tent for the sun. It comes forth like a bridegroom coming from his tent, rejoices like a champion to run his course. At one end of the heavens is the rising of the sun. To its furthest end it runs its course. There is nothing concealed from its burning heat. The law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The decrees of the Lord are steadfast. They give wisdom to the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right. They gladden the heart. The command of the Lord is clear. It gives light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, abiding forever. The judgments of the Lord are true. They are all of them just. They are more to be desired than gold, than quantities of gold. And sweeter are they than honey flowing from the cup. So in them your servant finds instruction. Great reward is in their keeping. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is one of those psalms that to a modern reader can appear very disjointed. That we have an appreciation of the stars, the sun, the heavens, and then some odd reflections about language, messages, and then a long discussion of the law of the Lord, decrees, precepts, commands, judgments. Um, and from a modern perspective, those things can seem to be somewhat disconnected, or at least you have to draw the lines between the dots. For Dante and for anyone in the Middle Ages, probably anyone reading before the 18th century, the connection would have just been immediate and obvious that the heavens, the stars, the sun, the planets, what they reveal is an orderly universe. That every night the stars trace the same path through the sky, rising in the east, setting in the west, tracing a phenomenal circle around, or a phenomenal series of circles around the North Star, the North Circumpolar Pole. And the sun and the moon and the planets wander across the firmament of the stars. The stars themselves don't change position relative to each other, but the sun and the moon and the planets do. But in the changing of their positions, you can see another order, that the sun takes its 365 and a quarter day path through the loop of the stars to come back to the same place. The moon has its own course that it obeys with regularity, as do the other planets. And so when the medieval looked up at the stars, and they saw stars of the kind that we will never see. If you can imagine a world lit only by fire, if you've been up camping in the mountains of Colorado, if you've been up to one of my favorite places on Earth that unfortunately is coming to the end of its earthly mission, is St. Benedict's Monastery in Old Snowmass. The stars that you see up there are just so much brighter than anything you can see here in Denver. But the stars that the medievals would have seen in a world lit only by fire would have been far brighter still. And in a world without nightly television and certainly without cell phones, what do you look at? Well, you can pay attention to the motions of the stars and their absolute beauty. And the stars would have revealed themselves in the medieval world. The colors, the colors that you can only really see through a telescope were visible to the naked eye. That you could see the stars that were blue or red or orange. The colors stood out. The planet Venus was visible during the day for far longer than it is today. Venus and Mercury disappear as soon as the sun has broken the horizon. In the medieval world, they were quite often visible for hours afterwards. So in looking up at the heavens, you had this picture of order, an order that was difficult to understand because it was very hard to calculate, but you could see that it was absolutely ordered. And so the connection between that and no speech, no word whose voice goes unheeded, their sound goes forth through all the earth. Just as the physical creations of God have their order throughout the cosmos, so do the divine commands. So does the divine word that goes throughout the entire cosmos. And then we come to the law of the Lord, the decrees of the Lord, the precepts of the Lord, the command of the Lord, the judgments of the Lord. All of these are strictly analogous to the motion of the heavenly bodies, because all of them reflect the will of God in their different ways. The will of God for how material creation should govern itself, both in the movement of the planets and the stars and the regulation of human society. The idea of chaos or anarchy is a theoretical concept in the medieval world. What you see in reality is divine order that permeates everything. And the Divine Comedy gets its unity from this. And we have this in Catholic education, that all knowledge is one, all knowledge is united, and all knowledge is united because creation is united. All creation serves a particular purpose. Everything in creation has its own distinct purpose. You know, nothing, there's no redundancy in creation. Nature abhors a vacuum was one of the ideas that they had in the Middle Ages, that you couldn't have nothing, because that seems something like chaos. But you also don't have redundancy. Everything that exists because God created it for a very specific purpose in salvation history. And when you take that idea and you see it permeate the universe, then you begin to see how understanding astronomy and calculating the paths of the planets is immediately connected to understanding moral codes for man, because they have the exact same source, and they're just simply different manifestations of the divine will. Where it becomes difficult, the judgments of the Lord are true, they are all of them just. They are all just, however, human comprehension prevents us from always seeing exactly how. And that is one of the fundamental problems that Dante wrestles with throughout the entire comedy, including in Paradiso. It's impossible to look at the world and not see what appears to be incredible injustice. Injustice that is created by man and seemingly permitted by God. Injustice that seems in some cases to be part of the divine plan itself. And here I would be referring to the condemnation of pagans. The mystery of salvation is a judgment that does not avail itself to human understanding. Knowing that we can't understand it does not make it less mysterious and frustrating. And that's something that Dante wrestles with and does the best that he can to provide the best answer. There were a couple quotations that I had just about Dante. Why is Dante worth reading? 700 years later, when the world that we live in seems to have almost no similarity to the world that Dante wrote in. Why should we read Dante? If we're going to read something ancient, why do we not just read scripture? And I'm certainly not suggesting that we read Dante instead of scripture, just to be entirely clear. But why is Dante worth the effort? Because Dante is a tremendous effort. Dante is not pleasure reading for quite some time. So Benedict XV wrote on the 700th anniversary, or the 600th anniversary of Dante's death. He wrote, "In praeclara sumorum. Indeed, while there is no lack of great Catholic poets who combine the useful with the enjoyable," and of course that's what makes a poet, is having something that is useful but that is also enjoyable. We can love Thomas Aquinas very much, and I absolutely do, but I don't think there is anybody who pleasure reads the Summa Theologica or the Summa Contra Gentiles. It's very useful, but not necessarily that enjoyable. But the poet's job is to be both. Dante has the singular merit that while he fascinates the reader with a wonderful variety of pictures, with marvelously lifelike coloring, with supreme expression and thought, he draws him also to the love of Christian knowledge. And all know how he said openly that he composed his poem to bring to all vital nourishment. And I love that phrase of nourishment, that I think we can all recognize those things that we have read in our lives that were the most significant. They weren't just fascinating, they weren't just enjoyable, they weren't just useful. The experience itself of reading provided one of the highest joys that you can have in earthly life, I say. That you have something that is absolute delight, and the knowledge that it's useful, the enjoyment of it, the experience of great literature in which you lose yourself in something, you go beyond yourself. And it is nourishing. When you've read something wonderful and you finally close the book and put it down, you are fed. And we all require nourishment. And Dante can provide that. The verb that's used there, fascinates, is one. When Benedict uses that, fascinate in modern English has been so cheapened that it's just it just means something that's interesting. What fascinate means in its literal sense, from the Latin, is a form of incantation. Fascination was originally a magical form in which the magician or whatever object it was that had the power to fascinate so captured the attention of the person reading it or drawn by its power that that person was, I mean, we use this phrase spellbound, but we almost never think about what it literally means. But fascination is, in its origin, literally does mean spellbound. That you are entranced, you're held almost against your will, willingly, but you're held against your will momentarily as you do this reading. And in the case of Dante, the fascination that he provides is not just useful, but it's vital nourishment. Pope Paul VI, in 1965, he was writing on the 700th anniversary of Dante's birth. The aim of the Divine Comedy is primarily practical and transformative. The title that I gave this class is A User's Guide to Salvation, because that's literally what Dante wrote. He didn't write a poem simply to be entertaining and then try to throw some doctrine in while you aren't looking. He wrote a poem that was intended to cause conversion. After reading the Divine Comedy, you were supposed to recognize the pitfalls of your own life, and you were supposed to desire closeness to God. There's a word, achate. It's translated as sloth or sloth, but that word sloth or sloth is so far from what the ancient sin, the way that sloth is used today, is so far from what achadia meant for millennia, that I'm just going to call it achadia. Achadia is spiritual sadness. And it's a sin that can only occur in the person who knows God and has had the experience of loving God. But as we all know in our own lives, loving God and having your heart on fire, living zealously, it's not something that once that love of God is fired within you, that you're good for the rest of your life and you'll always feel them. At some point in time, the love of God for all of us diminishes. And bit by bit, we find other things to replace it with, things that are immediately gratifying, or in some cases, not even gratifying, in some cases, destructive. But this is what achadia is. It's to no longer desire the love of God, to no longer desire to be inflamed by the love of God and to live that life of absolute zeal. So what Dante writes in the Divine Comedy is a spur against achadia. It's a spur against everything we have, all of those lies and self-deceptions that we tell ourselves, that these things that are distracting us from God are good for some reason. Because a lot of them can be good. It's possible for something that is ostensibly a good work to be a distraction. If we end up serving on a church committee because it fills up time, because it gives us reputation, because it allows us to be busy, and we can't handle not being busy, then that's one of the bizarre from the modern standpoint of achadia as activism. And that is a form that Dante was very well aware of, because it's something that Dante himself was guilty of and recognizes that he was guilty of. All of the self-deceptions that we can have about the manner in which we love things. Everything that God creates is created for a purpose and to a specific end. And for Dante, everything that man does because of love. There is no one out there that knowingly, willingly, intentionally does evil. When people commit evil acts, it's not because they desire evil, it's because they love something that is itself evil, or they love something good in a disordered way. The desire to do evil is something that is almost self-contradictory and is very incredibly rare. The experience of loving something incorrectly, either loving an object that we shouldn't, such as pride, loving your own reputation, is something that we should not love. Envy, loving to see other people fail because it makes you look better comparatively, that is something that we should not love. Or loving things that are good, but loving them in a manner that is opposed to their end in the divine order of things. Food, material, sex, all of these things are good things in and of themselves. But all of them can be loved in and of themselves as something that we delight in, rather than as something that brings us closer to God. And if we love things that should just be an end, or if we love things that should be a medium rather than an end, and we love those things as an end, then we're going to make ourselves miserable. So the Divine Comedy being practical and transformative, it's intended to stir us out of this spiritual torpor that's caused by, in almost every case, self-deception. And the only way that we can awaken ourselves to self-deception is by recognizing how self-deception happens. And that's what Inferno is. Inferno is a series of portraits of self-deceivers. people who thought they were pursuing something good and instead end up damned. Purgatory is where we learn to correct those impulses that we have towards loving our reputation, towards loving respect that we have among others, towards loving honors, towards loving food, instead of something that is simply nourishing as something that in and of itself creates delight. Dante gives us the Divine Comedy to rip off the Band-Aid, as it were, of our self-deceptions so that we can desire, so that we can recognize ourselves to be in need of genuine conversion and desire that conversion. So its aim is not only to be poetically beautiful or morally good, but on a higher level, it proposes a radical change, an interior conversion that would take us from disorder to wisdom, from sin to holiness, from misery to happiness, from the contemplation of the horrors of hell to the beatitude of paradise. And this might be the best summary of the Divine Comedy in the fewest words that exists. And we'll notice, and Paul VI was an outstanding reader of Dante, that would take us from disorder to wisdom. That disorder isn't opposed to order, it's opposed to wisdom. Because order itself is the nature of creation. Wisdom is the ability to recognize. Disorder is the inability to recognize the order that God has created. Order is there. Disorder is our own fumbling with things. Wisdom is the recognition of how God has created things, and how we're to use those things to return to God. From sin to holiness, from misery to happiness. And this other point, that sin is not enjoyable. The sinner is essentially miserable. And this is so essential. It's not an accident. The sinner is essentially miserable because the definition of sin is to pursue something in a way, to pursue something believing that it can give us beatitude, joy, gaudium, not happiness, because happiness is fleeting. We can use that to describe a lot of things. But when medieval writers use that term that translates as joy, gaudium, gaudium is the kind of ultimate happiness that we can only derive from God. It's what Boethius, the 5th and 6th century philosopher and theologian, described as the highest good. That good that once we have it makes us completely satisfied. And once we have it, we cannot lose it. Because sin perverts the natural order of things, sin is a turning away from God. And if we turn away from God for any reason, we cannot find joy, because there is no joy outside of God. So whatever happens in the moment, the sinner might be momentarily happy, but the sinner cannot be said to live in a state of happiness. The sinner lives in a state of misery and temporarily assuages that misery with disordered goods that can provide a momentary spark of happiness, but not true joy. And then finally, coming from, this is an Italian critic, but the way that she wrote about why modern people would approach ancient literature, I think it's probably the best reason for approaching literature. If a man of our day stops a moment curious and thoughtful, to pass over the words of an ancient poet. He doesn't do it for love of subtle critical questions or of a pointed philological excursion. Neither does he do it for a love of delightful phrasing, of efficacious sonority, of clever verbal architecture, of charming wordplays. These are all things that were so important in classical and medieval literature. Delightful phrasing, efficacious sonority, having the music of poetry sound be effective, of clever verbal architecture, of charming wordplays. All of these things are so important in ancient literature, and they are so unimportant in modern literature because we've abandoned beauty. The modern world doesn't know beauty. The modern world is suspicious of beauty and can see it only as superficiality. And that's why we design ugly buildings and write awful books and create movies that are just streams of flashing lights, but can contain no beauty. The ancient world had beauty and delighted. But we can't get that out of ancient literature because we're not ready for it. It takes a long time to develop a taste for beauty in literature. Probably decades. All of these things that were beauty in the classical world of literature, all of this is a game that appears to him more obsessive than fascinating. And that verb comes up again. If you look at this is why students, of course, hate reading Homer or Virgil when they bother to read Homer rather than just reading Cliff Notes. Because the way that ancient literature proceeds appears to be obsessive and focusing on minutia rather than storyline, plot line, character. But these things that are examples of beauty, they've lost the ability to fascinate us. And because they've lost the ability to fascinate, they are therefore superficial. The reader of our day is interested in man, contemporary man, ancient man. And if he can know about him, future man existing as man, who struggles to live and to be a man, and nevertheless fights to live and to be a man. That is something that we can still immediately appreciate. We live in a world where basically the only literary genre that still exists is the novel. And the novel depends almost entirely upon character. It's not a mistake that Western civilization that's reached, I hope we've reached the apex of hyper-individualism. I'd hate to think that we can go any further. It's not a mistake that a culture that's absolutely endued in individualism can only appreciate the literary genre that is about character development, because character development is what the individual who can only see himself as an individual can appreciate in literature. Seeing how a person develops and feeling morally superior to that character's flaws. But if this is what interests us, the character and that character's development, this is what we can find in the Divine Comedy. Dante's character development, that Dante titles this, he just called it the comedy. The word divine was added a couple hundred years later, in the early days of book printing, because there were always hype men, and they decided adding divine to comedy would somehow improve upon it and lead to better sales. And they were right. We still call it the Divine Comedy today. But Dante called it the comedy because in his definition from ancient literature, a comedy is a genre that begins quite simply with man, the character that is involved begins in a state of misery and ends in a state of happiness. That's all a comedy is. Tragedy begins with a character in the state of happiness and ends in misery. If we're interested in the human being and the human experience, that is what the Divine Comedy provides better than any other work of literature to this day. You have Dante's own agonized presentation of his biography. We begin with Dante being lost, and we end with Dante being saved. And for that to happen, Dante, the character, has to undergo the conversion that he talks about. And that's exactly what we see. But along the way, he learns by speaking to individual human souls. And with every soul that he encounters, we have that soul's story. We have 100 different narratives of individual human beings that struggled to live and be human beings, that fought to be human beings, and that sometimes tragically erred in that struggle and found themselves, and not found themselves, and damned themselves with their own actions. And I was going to say, how does the Divine Comedy begin? Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. Nel mezzo di cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. Literally, the correct path became lost, or was lost to me. As Dante, the character, appears at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, he is spiritually lost. He is spiritually lost and in danger of damnation. And so the development that we get to see in Dante, Dante does not get to see the afterlife because he is chosen by God as an example of moral perfection that gets to have this remarkable experience. Far from it. He's one who is incredibly gifted by God, who has misused those gifts and is courting his own damnation. And he is pitied by the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary takes pity upon him, and the Virgin Mary speaks to Rachel, Rachel of the Old Testament, the beloved wife of Jacob of Israel. And then in this wonderful progression of messengers, Rachel then goes to Saint Lucy, who we then discover is Dante's personal patron saint. Rachel goes to Saint Lucy and says, "Your Dante is lost. You're the one who has devoted himself to you is lost." And then St. Lucy goes to Beatrice, who in the fiction of the Divine Comedy is saved and a saint. And St. Lucy gives Beatrice the mission of going down and doing what it takes to save Dante's soul. And what will it take to save Dante's soul? What will it take for one of the brilliant minds in all of history to acknowledge that he is wrong, and so wrong that he is courting damnation? And what it will take is a walk through Inferno to see the damned, to understand how they damned themselves, to come to understand vice and sin. And those are two words that we have to keep very separate: vice and sin. Vice is the tendency that we have. Sin is a willed action. The only way for Dante to be shaken awake from his own spiritual torpor, from his own achadia, is to see the damned in hell. And then to go through purgatory. And in purgatory, to see those who confessed their sins, who converted, but who nevertheless had souls that were still marked by all of these vices, all of these tendencies to sin. And in purgatory, their job is to cleanse their soul of those impulses, those tendencies toward sins, to make themselves, as we'll have in Purgatory 1. For better waters now, the little bark of my poetic powers hoists its sail and leaves behind the cruelest of seas. And I shall sing about that second realm, where a man's soul goes to purify itself and become worthy to ascend to heaven. Percorrer miglior acque alze le vele omai le navicelle del mio ingegno, che lascia dietro a sé mar sì crudele, e cantaro di quel secondo regno, ove lo spirito umano si purga, e di salir al ciel diventa degno, where the soul purifies itself and makes itself worthy to ascend to. And purgatory is one of those delightfully misunderstood dogmas. And misunderstood for a lot of very good reasons. It's been misused for purposes throughout its history. Quite often we can think of purgatory as a settling of accounts, that some kind of an accountant god is opening up the bill of our life, tallying up all of the sins, and then adding up the amount of time that will be necessary to cover away the temporal punishment of sins. And the temporal punishment of sin, yes, of course, that is what happens in purgatory, but the purpose of this is not to justify our bill before God, because that's impossible. The purpose of this is to undo the damage that we have done to our own souls. In sin, we damage our soul. In turning away from God. And if we think for a moment about bad habits, and if we think for a moment about our attempts to overcome bad habits, and how almost impossibly difficult that is, when we sin, we create habits. We might have had a certain impulse towards sin, but by committing that act, the most absurd line that we say, the most dangerous phrase that we have in our entire life is just this once. Just this one time I will X. Just this one time I will Y. I'll enjoy it once and then I'll be done with it forever. That, of course, never happens. Because when we do that thing for the very first time, by doing it for the first time, we make it so much easier to do it the second, the third, and the fourth. By committing that first sin, we set ourselves on the path to creating a bad habit. And once we've created that habit of sin, it absolutely has an effect on our soul. It makes sin easy and it makes virtue difficult. And so the purpose of purgatory is to undo all of the damage. Say hi, Lucy.
I don't see them.
No, they have their cameras off, so you can't see.
Oh.
This is my older daughter, Lucy. Oh, there we go. Christina's turned her camera on and she's waving. You can wave back.
I'm Lucy. Oh, hi, I'm Lucy.
Hi, Lucy. Nice to meet you. I'll turn my camera off so your daddy can talk.
Hi, Lucy.
Lucy was born the very first year that I taught this class for the biblical school, the lay division. And my wife suggested the name, and it wasn't until I was teaching this class that I realized that I had inadvertently, if such a thing can be inadvertent rather than unconsciously following providence, I had inadvertently named my first daughter after the patron saint of the poet that I've spent my life studying. It's so funny to think that I'd spent literally decades studying Dante and agreed with the name of Lucy for my child without even recognizing that that was the name of Dante's patron saint. Okay, since Lucy has decided that we need to go on to different slides, I think I'll just stop whatever I was saying where I said it. But that discussion there, I think, is a good sample of what the lectures in this course will look and sound. And at this point in time, I guess, once again, I'll call for other questions. If there's anything else about how the course is run, what resources we'll use. For each lesson, I've written a very short introduction that I keep on. I hate saying that I have a blog. That just makes me feel awful. But I do maintain one for this class, and I'll include those links. And the blog has these little introductions to each lecture. And it also has links to other resources. Along with the commentary written by Father Pearson, there's a few other works that I suggest. One of them is the little leatherette book by Tan that is, I think it's Overcoming Deadly Sin, something along those lines. I don't have it right in front of me right now. But that's an excellent resource because so much of the divine purgatory itself is structured explicitly on the capital sins. And then there's also an edition of Thomas Aquinas's Summa that it's not an abridged edition, but it's an edition that gets rid of all of the arguments, pro and con, the various things that Thomas is discussing, and it only includes Thomas Aquinas's final answer to all of his questions. And in the blog, I include page references to that are good supplemental readings for each lecture. And I will also have a list of biblical passages that are significant to that lesson. And I think I'll just stop there. If there's other questions, I'm happy to stay as long as I need to answer those. Thank you, Lucy. But if there aren't any questions, I think I'll stop talking at you since I'm going to do more than enough of that over the next year.
I know I came in late, so I can attend the other that you're going to have. So I'm used to the format for the biblical school where you have the reading, the homework, the small group. Is this going to be just lecture?
Yes.
So
for enrichment courses, enrichment courses do not have written homework. I'll give you in advance what we're going to be reading. But I've designed the lectures so that if you haven't done the reading or haven't done it as carefully as possible, you can still absolutely follow the lecture, because I don't want to create a situation in which people skip classes for that reason. And some people actually prefer to listen to the lecture first and then do the reading, so that they have a better sense of what it is they're going to be reading. But because, and this isn't my decision, I just want to underline this, because it's an enrichment course, there's no homework, there are no exams, there's no written assignments. That's a permanent marker. Please be very careful with that, Lucy.
And then, you were reading, and was the comedy written in Italian, or was it?
Oh, yeah.
I think you were speaking Italian, right?
Yes. The linguistic question of the Divine Comedy is something that I can talk about all day, and sometimes we'll talk about possibly more than I should. It was written in Italian, and it was the first significant intellectual work to be written in Italian. Before Dante, the only things that were written in Italian were short lyrical poems, which he spent in his youth. He was a lyrical lover. Those things were thought to be appropriate for Italian. And then short stories could be appropriate for Italian. Those were written as well. The Divine Comedy is the first piece of serious literature to be written in the Italian vernacular. And it's because Dante wrote it that way that modern Italian has the form that it does. Medieval Italy was incredibly, yeah, you can show them all the prayer card. Medieval Italy was so incredibly divided that literally every city in Italy had its own particular dialect of Italian that was incomprehensible once you got about 15 miles outside of that city. And that situation continued in Italy up until about World War II. Italian is so delightful that it's one of the very few national languages that, in a sense, is completely artificial. It's a literary language. It's based on the language that Dante wrote in, and then because Dante wrote in what was the Florentine dialect, the next generation of writers, Boccaccio and Petrarch, also wrote it. And when you have three of the greatest authors, please don't write enough. Let's just put the pen away. Yes, you can write in your own books if you would like. Please do not write in mine with pen. Once you've had those three authors writing in that, I'm going to stop trying to answer that question because clearly my daughter's did not to. Yes, it's written in Italian. It was not written in Latin, and that is a huge issue that we'll talk about repeatedly.
Okay, well, thank you, because I apologize for coming in late, but I appreciate your answering the questions. Okay, thank you.
And this one is my 4-year-old Amelia. And I discovered after we chose the name Amelia that it's actually a Gothic name. Amel was the royal family of the Goths that actually brought down, that replaced the Roman Empire. Amel means forceful or energetic. So this delightful little girl here is named after the family that brought down the Roman Empire and literally means energetic. And she lives up to that name every day.
Very apt.
So say bye-bye.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I will be upstairs in just a minute,
Thank
okay?
you for honoring the Fabian
I will
family.
be up and you're laughing, not crying.
Oh, you are just-
Thank you. Looking forward to the course.
I'm looking forward to teaching. Thank you all very much. If you have any questions, please email me. My email, it should be available on the Lay Division website. It's seth.fabian@archden.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If you've noticed, the only problem will be you might get an answer that is far longer than what you were.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a good night, and I look forward to seeing you when we begin in early September.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.